Thank you so much, Cory and Audrey, for being here. My name is Matt Prewitt. I'm president of RadicalxChange Foundation. And I'm here today with Cory Doctorow and Audrey Tang. Cory is a science fiction novelist, journalist, and technology activist. He's a contributor to many magazines, websites, and newspapers, and a longtime consultant to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. His novels have been translated into many languages. His most recent books include Attack Surface. My name is Matt Prewitt. I'm president of RadicalxChange Foundation. And I'm here today with Cory Doctorow and Audrey Tang. Cory is a science fiction novelist, journalist, and technology activist. He's a contributor to many magazines, websites, and newspapers, and a longtime consultant to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. His novels have been translated into many languages. His most recent books include Attack Surface, sequel to Little Brother, Walk Away, Radicalized, Chokepoint Capitalism, many other great works. Super excited to hear from you today. And Audrey Tang. Audrey is Taiwan's first digital minister and the first openly transgender government minister in the world. Disillusioned with the failure of the emerging culture of Web 2.0 to live up to its democratic ideals, Tang returned to Taiwan to pair her technology expertise with grassroots social movements. With the civic hacking collective GovZero, Tang and her collaborators began to fork the government, offering shadow implementations of government services and leading large-scale online participatory deliberations on policy. And today, Taiwan is really a leading example of digital democracy, in large part thanks to Audrey's amazing work. So very, very pleased that you all are able to be here today. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to begin the conversation by asking each of you to perhaps say a little bit more about your own work. So in particular, I'd love to hear what you think is the aspect of your own work that is least well understood. So in other words, what is it that you take yourself to be doing in your life, and perhaps how does it differ from how people might perceive your work? And maybe let's start with Cory.
It's a tall order. I guess people tend to assume, I think, all information should just be freely available without any restrictions. I think that's a cartoon character of me I sometimes meet out there on the internet when people are criticizing my work. And I would say that it's fairer to say the kind of more nuanced version of that is that I think certain kinds of information control, whatever benefit they deliver, come at high costs. And that when we take those costs to be automatically worth it, right? When we say, no price is too high to pay to achieve some policy goal by controlling some kind of information, we tend to not be very serious or thoughtful. Back after 9/11, I remember a lot of people were saying no price is too high to pay to end air terrorism. And Bruce Schneier, who's a friend of mine and a cryptographer, security expert, he said, great, let's just stop flying. He said, well, that's too high a price, right? There is a price that's too high to pay for any of these things. And, if the price that we pay, for example, for allowing creators to have a very streamlined, easy to implement process to remove unauthorized copies of their work from the internet, is that it becomes very easy for anyone to remove anything from the internet. I think we need to be really explicit that that's a very high price to be paying. And, also that speaking as someone who works in the arts and derives the majority of his living from artistic work, I think that there's a duty on people who work in the arts to be specifically extremely skeptical of proposals to make it very easy to remove things from the public eye, because historically that has not been used to our benefit.
Super. And Audrey, how would you describe your work?
That's music to my ears. I want to first answer to that because our upcoming ministry at the time of recording, August 23rd, It's 4 days till our new Ministry of Digital Affairs, or MODA, gets set up. And MODA was able to resist the cyber attacks a couple of weeks ago because we host our origin service, our website, on interplanetary file system, on IPFS, and where it's impossible to take anything down. And also the entire directory listing is available to people in more than 200 countries, in more than 200,000 computers. And so we use this to make a point that the price you pay of source of withstanding in a resilient fashion, the tampering and so on, and denial of service in particular, well, is by just giving up this whole thing about access control. We license everything on our website as Creative Commons 0, which is basically saying we won't sue you, whichever copies or modifications you make. And so to answer your question, Matt, sometimes I'm portrayed as this digital democracy progressive advocate, someone who's literally living in the future, who is speeding up on the narrowing corridor toward future freedom, to paraphrase Eshimolu. But what we're actually doing is widening the corridor. Widening the mutual trust, not necessarily ignoring the speeding limit and taking our liberties at running toward the future, but rather by keeping, be sure that, as I mentioned in my job description, when we hear the singularity is near, let's remember the plurality is here. So keeping the plurality that's currently here, that's actually my top goal, not advancing any particular singularity visions.
Great. That's a great transition to my next question, which is that, I think you both have a really nuanced and singular point of view on the relationship between technology and society in many respects, but in one respect, because I think each of you are in some ways very positive about technology and in other respects very critical, following patterns that are perhaps not the usual patterns people encounter in the public discourse. And yet it seems that for each of you, the concept of plurality or pluralism plays an important role in how you square the circle or how you navigate these tensions in terms of technology and society. So I wonder if we could spend a moment talking about how each of you understand the term pluralism, what it means to you, and how you think about it in this context. Perhaps starting with Audrey.
Okay. Plurality. It's interesting because in Mandarin, in Taiwan, 数位 means both digital and plural. So as much as we can say, I think it stems from digits, like many fingers, not binary. So anyway, the point here is that as much as I'm a digital minister, I'm also a plural minister. And to me, it means first and foremost, collaboration across diversity. I used the Clay-Shirky distinction between collaboration and cooperation in the sense that it is actually to each participating faction, like the Uber drivers or taxi drivers, they're just advancing their own interest. It is just that the mechanism in plurality is designed in such a way that it incentivizes everyone expressing their authentic viewpoints instead of trying to game the system. And the end result is that we see very plainly in a reflective way that most of us agree with most of the points most of the other disconnected communities make. And that makes rough consensus running code possible. So some sort of coordination, you can call it collaboration, cooperation across diversity, celebrating this diversity, taking it as input to democracy, to me is the core of plurality.
There's a New Zealand software developer who made, I think, my favorite tweet of all time, which is, I'm old enough to remember when the internet wasn't just 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. Right? And there is something kind of dismal about that homogenization. Formally, it's pretty dismal. Like, we have things that look like tweets, and we have things that look like Facebook updates, and we have things that look like TikToks. And, within those constraints, people do lots of things in the same way that there are a lot of ways to write a sonnet, say, or even a haiku. But, I'm not just old enough to remember when the web wasn't just 5 giant websites. I remember when every website looked different, when everything was different, when there was a kind of explosion of formal experimentation and people creating new forms. I was just talking about this with a friend and remembering my friend Justin Hall, who was, I think, the first blogger, whose website was so old that blogging tools didn't exist when he started it. And so he wrote every day's blog post by hand. And he made each page look different based on the content of that blog post, right? And obviously that's a lot to do. I'm not saying we should all like gnaw our own furniture out of whole logs with our own teeth every morning or whatever, right? It's fine to have some automation and tooling. But what's happened is that the decisions made by an extremely small number of people have an enormous bearing on how you live your life and express yourself. And that's true in terms of our industrial policy. You know, when there's everything in your grocery aisle is made by either Procter & Gamble or Unilever. And whenever a product gets successful that isn't made by Procter & Gamble or Unilever, they buy that company and then make a big announcement. And they say, well, we bought your beloved local, cereal maker because we know you value choice. Well, what if my choice is to not have my life structured by the decisions of the executives who run your firm, right? That's the one choice there's no room for, scope for in there. And so for me, pluralism is all about the locus of control. A pluralistic world is a world in which the loci of control are spread out, and where even if there are intelligent defaults that keep you from getting into trouble and things are well designed and well functioning and they work well, right? The dictator is benevolent. You still have the insurance policy that if the dictator turns malignant, you can leave. And you also have the option that if you want to do something that's just not countenanced by the person who made the choices about what the defaults would be, that person's superstitions or short-sightedness or just their lack of appreciation for something that didn't exist when they set those defaults. Think of people who have, I have a solar array on the roof of my house, and the company that made it decided that it would only work when it had a 3G connection. And then they decided that they weren't going to maintain their 3G infrastructure. And now my solar panels generate nothing because there's a supply chain hiccup and I can't get a Wi-Fi interface for it. And that's fine because I've got good constant power. But if the mains power went out and I had power generation on my roof and I couldn't connect it to my home because of a choice made by someone else, a choice that may have had lots of good reasons for it, but I can't override that choice, then that is a profoundly bad failure mode. And, the people who experience those failure modes every day are people with disabilities and people who live in social contexts or economic contexts that are different from the social and economic context of the people who make design decisions. So the people who are using WhatsApp or Facebook or Reddit or any of those other tools in places where there isn't consistent electricity or consistent internet access, or where you don't have access to modern hardware, or people who have disabilities. I have a low vision disability, and about a third of the web is unreadable by me. And to make it readable, I use Firefox's no distractions reader mode, which just turns it into black text on a white background. Lots of firms intentionally block that to make sure that you see their ads. And, I understand they have economic imperatives, but for me, I want the locus of control to devolve to me, because I know things about my situation that the designer could never anticipate, that the manufacturer could never anticipate, that are beyond the ability of even the most diligent product team or even policymaker to enumerate, much less accommodate. And so for me, pluralism is about not just freedom in a kind of abstract sense, but the freedom to structure your life so that it is survivable in some very meaningful way.
I wonder if it's possible to talk a little bit about sort of plurality of what? Because people are, I think that it can be difficult to connect this sort of pluralism paradigm in the sort of technical context to democracy and to the political context where people are more explicitly dealing with, the attempts to cooperate across difference, attempts to take decisions together as a society.
Dealing with antitrust laws and interoperable protocol designs. Yes, that's quite abstract.
But so I don't. Do either of you have thoughts about how to bridge that? How to bridge the technical conversation and the political conversation, basically?
Well, I think interoperability is the tie that ties together, because it's fundamentally the right to assemble, right? Cory talked about the right to hack or to fork or to bring technology to someone who demands more of technology in an open way. On the other hand, we're far beyond the era where only people living in the same neighborhood consider themselves neighbors, right? Nowadays, people who share similar conditions, even across time zones, decide that they are neighbors together, and they can hack together to make sure that technology do their bidding, fitting their particular use. In the political sphere, it creates a very interesting point of overlapping jurisdiction, because the people who decide, for example, that the websites should be readable by people with low vision, they spawn multiple jurisdictional contexts with different laws and different customs and different norms. Nevertheless, I think the political freeing the future call says that just like people who are suffering from climate change because they live in the places closer to water or wildfire, regardless of their jurisdiction, this stakeholder community need to have a sort of political representation, exactly the same as the climate change example I just surfaced. So when we're designing like antitrust, interoperability, and so on, the way to assemble those communities so they make coherent norm demands, and it's the state's role, to me, to amplify those norm demands so that people who previously feel helpless because they may be suffering the same condition, except they don't have a technologist training, can discover their tribe, their community, and express the norms so that we can ask the private sector to first interoperate with those norms.
I think that's very well said. And I want to say that the failure mode of the criticism of technological solutionism is that people say, oh, well, if your advocacy for digital self-determination requires that you be a hacker, then it's just digital self-determination for, educated white guys in Silicon Valley. And the reality is that digital self-determination doesn't solely require or always require that you be able to yourself hack your tools. It can be every bit as much as being able to nominate the toolsmith that you trust. And, everywhere you go in the world, there are people who are figuring this stuff out. And indeed, if you're affluent white dude from Silicon Valley, you don't have to be a hacker, because every product design team sits down and says, how can I make you happy? Whereas, this thing that nerds say, right? It's so easy, my mom can use it. Like, none of the product design teams are trying to figure out how to make things good for moms. Moms have to be like expert ninja hackers to get stuff to work, because the stuff's not designed for them. And so to say it is important that people be able to seize the means of computation and reconfigure the technologies around them is just about elevating people who already have no problems. I think it's a category error. And I want to say that if you want to bridge the technical and the political, I think the framework to do this with is a human rights framework. So, I'm very interested in competition as a remedy for certain kinds of technological ills, right? The fact that Mark Zuckerberg makes a lot of bad choices about how we should live our digital lives, we could address that in part by trying to make him a better Zuck, right? I am skeptical about how perfect we will make Mark Zuckerberg, even if we try really hard. And I also think that there isn't a person out there who should have Mark Zuckerberg's job. Right? Unelected social media czar 4 billion people's lives is not a problem because the wrong person has that job. It's a problem because that job shouldn't exist. So yeah, we can try to make Zuck better. We should hold him to account when he does bad things, but we should also just make it easy for people to leave. But it's not enough to say that we need competition, because you could compete to be worse than Zuck. So the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK did an absolutely amazing 800-page report on the ad tech industry. Just like a banger. Like, and I say that as someone who doesn't like boring documents. Like, it's a good read. And then there's this part in the middle of it where they're talking about this thing that has been responsible for the ad tech duopoly having such a durable advantage, Google and Facebook, like just creaming anyone who tries to compete with them in ad tech. And they say, oh, well, what Google and Facebook can do is something called attribution, where after you see an ad on the web and then you go out and you buy something, because they have all your location data and they're buying all your credit card data and they're looking at all this other data sources, they can go, I showed Matt an ad, Matt bought the thing that was in the ad. And unsurprisingly, like, advertisers really like that. And, you know, given their druthers, they will place their ads with firms that can do attribution. And so the Competition and Markets Authority says, all right, how are we going to fix this? They say, I know, we're going to give everyone in Britain a permanent, lifelong advertising tracking ID. Because that way we can have competition in attribution, right? We'll always know if you bought something after seeing an ad. So you could have like SMEs, you could have little companies, little British companies competing head to head with Google and Facebook. And this is a problem, right? This is the problem with talking about competition and talking about digital rights without talking about human rights, because we don't want competition to see who is most efficient at violating your human rights. And the way that you can make, the only framework we have for making the distinction between the areas where we want to have competition and the areas where the fact that we have two companies doing it, the reason that's a problem is not that there aren't more companies doing it. The problem is that there are two companies doing it. We need to make them stop. The only way to do that is to ask yourself, what higher set of principles, what human rights principles are we going to use as the frame for understanding what technologies need to be improved and what technologies need to be dismantled?
It's interesting, Cory. I've heard you speaking recently about with sort of an interesting critique of what you call libertarian exit, which I think is relevant here, right? Because one way of thinking about the sort of principle which puts a limitation on competition is human rights. And then another way of thinking of it, or the one way that I sometimes think about it, is that it's kind of like we have this choice between going farther apart from each other or like turning towards each other. So in other words, some of the solutions or some of the sort of futures that many people seem to be attracted to involve kind of people lessening their dependencies on one another, moving to a seastead, or getting enough money so that they can imagine they don't depend on anyone else, or that kind of a thing. Whereas other futures involve what sounds like, and may indeed be, some sort of more frictional and more difficult way of grappling with our dependencies and our interactions with one another. And yeah, I guess I'll pause there, but I wonder if that spectrum makes sense to you, or
I would say that the thing that we learned during the pandemic is that at like a microbial, irreducible level, we have a shared destiny, right? There's just not, you know, we can talk all we want about like the world is flat and like how our economies are entwined or whatever, but leave aside all of that. And there's just this thing where you cannot use contract to divide the swimming pool that is the world into a pool that has a pissing end and a non-pissing end, and say that the people who want to just stand in the pissing end can stand down there, and then if you don't like being in the pissing end, you can stand in the non-pissing end, and it'll just be, and like then contract will sort it all out. We'll just make free choices, and then we'll all get what we want. There are areas, really important ones, where we do have to figure out, per what Audrey was saying about multi-stakeholderism, where we do have to figure out a way that we can agree to certain baselines together that cannot be contracted out of, because the nature of power is that it is self-reinforcing. And so individuals, firms, or institutions that have a little bit of power can make accessing whatever it is they control, they can make a condition of that surrendering whatever power you have. And now they have more power, and they can use that to squeeze the next person, the next, and the next. And so you end up with a kind of weak signal amplification, to use another Clay Shirky term, where something that starts off as a minor advantage can become a very durable long-term advantage. And then you're back to Mark Zuckerberg, right? The unelected social media czar of 4 billion people's digital lives and the job that shouldn't exist. And so we need durable pluralistic institutions that come together and broker compromises that protect people from coercion in circumstances of great power imbalance. The reason that we, for example, ban selling your kidneys is not that it's impossible to conceive of a circumstance in which two people freely enter into that arrangement, but it is so much more likely that this will be a very abusive, terrible situation, which, we now see in Afghanistan, where people are brought to the brink of starvation or literally selling their organs and their children because the U.S. won't allow the country to access its international reserve. You can't just use contract to regulate that. You just end up in a world where might makes right.
I feel like a lot of Audrey's work, one of my favorite turns of phrase of all time came from Audrey, which is increasing the bandwidth of democracy, and that strikes me as relevant here because I think in a lot of these cases when we have decisions that it can't be made through contract properly, right? That need to be taken in through some kind of democratic mode. What we're striving for, what we're struggling against the need for, is better tools of doing that. Better tools of synthesizing many viewpoints, it seems to me that Audrey's work points the way towards really interesting possibilities here.
Yeah, higher bandwidth is a thing. On the other hand, a truck full of hard drives is very high bandwidth, but very high latency as well. And I think to the point of Cory's ideas of making sure that we use the human rights framework, sometimes lower latency is as important as high bandwidth in democracies. That is to say, if we make a perfectly good high bandwidth antitrust case, but the case takes 10 years to prepare, then the market situation would probably have changed during those 10 years. But of course, from a monopoly to a different monopoly of a different sort. But the point was that the justice that was lost because you cannot go back in time 10 years and say that, let's make it right? So I think a lot of the small, cheap and cheerful wins against monopolies in Taiwan are made from the social sector, utilizing the same tools that harkens back to the Weblog days, right? We translated around that time blog into 部落格, the tribal grid. So it has a very, very strong connection to the social sector, to the co-ops movement, to the social entrepreneurs, and so on. And indeed, in Taiwan, the PTT, the largest Reddit-like, is not-for-profit, running out of a dorm, right, of a Taiwan academic network, free of shareholders or advertisers, subsidized by the academic grants. So the point I'm making is that in Taiwan, we were able to very quickly get some sort of consensus on, for example, requiring Facebook leading up to election seasons to ban foreign-sponsored advertisements on social issues or disclose the entire honest advertisement, treating it the same as campaign donations, or making sure that Uber's surge pricing cannot undercut existing meters while allowing the local church and temples to run their own fleets in the rural areas and so on, not because we figure out the kind of global optimum of things, but because the social sector are given the social infrastructure, the digital public spaces, to very quickly coalesce into a set of coherent rights framework norms, saying that all drivers should enjoy these rights, or all constituents during elections should enjoy these rights to honest, accountable, and free from foreign influence, and so on. And then the states will become much easier, because for us, it's just to amplify those social norms from the human rights activists. But without such institutions. It would be like forcing everyone to have town halls, to have the local community calls, those listening sessions in the Facebook nightclub, where it's smoke-filled, private bouncers, addictive drinks, very noisy, and people wonder why they get rousy. It's not the people, it's the spaces.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I want to add, apropos this low latency idea, that, I think the nearly magical thing about digital technology and networks is how easy it makes collaboration. And, hierarchy and structure are not things to fetishize for their own right, in the same way that, competition is not something to fetishize on its own terms, right? It's competition in service of an end, and hierarchy in service of an end, and just enough and no more. And so it is amazing that we can use, say, code management tools to allow lots of people to contribute code in lots of different ways. Some of that code may never get used, and some of it may get used straight away, and some might get used and then edited later on. And that we can do that without having a lot of meetings. We can do that without, we can mostly just write code, right? Back to rough consensus and running code. We can mostly just write code instead of talking about what code we're going to write. And, talking about what code you're going to write is good if it makes the code better. But if you can reduce the amount of hours you have to spend in a meeting in order to produce the same amount of good code, then you're winning, right? Because the point is not to have the meeting. The point is to make the code. And, we are doing that in a lot of different domains. Like we are building digital collaboration tools that reduce the amount of hierarchy, bureaucracy, procedure that is required to do much more ambitious things. It's never going to go to zero, right? And we shouldn't understand it as making things go to zero. We should understand it as freeing up new groups of people to do things that weren't possible before because they don't need the same kind of institution that they had, and taking the institutions that were beneficial and freeing them to do more, because the weekly meetings they hold can now accomplish a lot more, because 90% of the stuff that used to happen in that meeting can now happen without a meeting at all. And so they can continue to use their institution to do more ambitious things. And, that's the wonderful power of the digital world, right? That we take things on the order of complexity of a skyscraper or a space program, like an encyclopedia or an operating system. And we build them with the kind of institutional overheads that used to be associated with like a really ambitious bake sale. And that is amazing. It's not to say that they don't have institutions. It's not to say those institutions can't be frustrating to work in. It's not, magic. It's not that it frees you from the requirement to ever like consider other people's feelings and priorities and desires. It just means that you can do more without having to do that. It becomes a lot more like an artisanal workplace, where if it's a sunny day, you go and you work outside on a task that has to be done outside. And if it's raining, you work inside. And a lot less like, say, an industrial workplace where you're on an assembly line. And it doesn't matter how nice the weather is. If you step off the assembly line and go outside to do some other task, the assembly line stops. And so, it is not a virtue that artisanal production before the assembly line meant that we had real material privation, and most people didn't have the clothes they need or the tools they needed or the shelter they needed. And it is a wonderful thing that industrialization stepped up production to make things more accessible. But the wonderful thing about it was the increased material abundance, not the way that it took away freedom. And if we can restore that freedom and keep the abundance intact, then it's a win for everyone.
Yeah, a lot of the most amazing pandemic prevention techniques collaborated by the GovZero community in Taiwan, from the mask maps, rapid testing maps, contact tracing methods that are privacy preserving, vaccination, and so on, literally began as a few Telegram or Signal calls leading up to, Matrix or Discord discussions or Slack discussions, and then HackMD collaborative documents, and it all happens in like 24 hours, and then we have a nationwide infrastructure. So people closest to the pain, they already have the good ideas. They probably already figure out how it will work for the country. It's just we need to empower them so that they form a tribe and then can surface and amplify the innovations to everyone.
So both of you have placed a lot of emphasis on the power of narrative and story in your work. And I wonder if you can say a little bit about that, both in terms of what, yeah, I mean, how do you see the role of science fiction and of imagining the future and of telling stories about what we're doing?
Oh, I guess I'll start then on that one.
Yes, Cory's topic.
Yeah. So look, the arguments are very abstract, right? That the policy arguments are very abstract. You're talking here about how do you bridge, tech policy in with human rights discourse and all this stuff. And it's super tricky to kind of wrap your head around. Like I said, reading 800-page documents from the Competition and Markets Authority is my jam, but it's like not everybody's jam. And it requires a pretty thick context to understand why it's exciting. You read a policy document, you're like, I get it. I have this friend, Saul Griffith, who's he's an electrification expert in Australia, whose whole thing is just like retooling to get us off fossil fuels. He's a genius electrical engineer. And he's got like this one thing he's super obsessed with, which is that all of our building codes require a certain kind of rigid conduit for a certain kind of electrical wire needed for solarization, and that there are flexible alternatives that aren't just like cheaper to make, but that can be like very easily like pulled through an attic, say, rather than having to bolt it around the entire frame of a building. And it like takes an order of magnitude off the cost of doing a solar installation. And if you're Saul and you read a policy document from like a local planning authority that says we are going to permit conduit with a long technical like ISO name alongside of this other conduit with a long ISO name in solar installations, provided that it passes an electrical safety inspection by a city inspector. If you're Saul, you're like, Indiana Jones just found the Holy Grail, right? If you're anyone else, it's just noise, right? It's just impenetrable. And so what fiction does is it takes these like super dry policy arguments, including a lot of really speculative ones, because one of the reasons Saul gets so excited is he has a specific vision of what it would be like to live under conditions of electrification. He wrote a really good book about this called Electrify, where he tries to like describe what your life would be like in an electrified world, right? Like what it would be like if your air quality in your home was 100 times greater because you got rid of your gas stove and replaced it with an induction top, and just like how that would feel in your lungs, right, over the long term. And he can vividly imagine what it would be like to live under a speculative circumstance that doesn't exist right now, right? Science fiction is that. Science fiction is a way to take something that is very abstract, that requires thick context to understand, and to turn it into a kind of architect's fly-through of a rendering of a world that doesn't exist yet, of the emotional state that you would be in if you were in that world. And, it's good for scaring the pants off of people and saying, this is what it could be like if it goes wrong. But it's also good for rallying people by saying, this is how great it could be if it all goes right. And so both of those are a really powerful way to change the world.
Yeah, it's such a powerful thing. And I recently heard a distinction that kind of jumped off the page to me, which is the difference between education and propaganda, right? So in education, you're trying to bring the audience into the same epistemic position that you're in, whereas with propaganda, you're not, right? And storytelling, and so and to me, I'm just curious what you think about this, I guess, because to me, this is a nice way of understanding the responsibility of a storyteller, right? Because if a storyteller who exercises that power in the right way can use it to much more effectively bring the audience into the epistemic position that they're in, for the same reason that you can help someone understand the import of a detail in an 800-page document by contextualizing it and telling a story about it. But you can also, as you say, sort of scare the pants off of people and hide the ball in a story. And I'm curious how you think about that responsibility as a writer. And then Audrey, I'd also love to hear if you've thought about that at all as a political communicator.
I hear what you're saying. That, I mean, it sounds like a way to reduce like this epistemic position alignment is to just say, like, if you're sincere in the thing that you want people to believe, then it's storytelling. If you're insincere, if you're trying to trick people, then it's propaganda. I think maybe that's true. I mean, I do think that there are a bunch of sincere people who believe terrible things and want to come up with stories that to tell them. I don't know. I mean, propaganda wasn't a negative term when it was coined. We made it negative with this kind of, I think, frankly, nonsensical idea that there's fiction that is not political, right? That there's like fiction that doesn't carry a political valence, that sometimes a story is just a story, and like it's just not true, and writers often don't know what story they're telling. You will find no more ardent admirer of Ray Bradbury than me, but Bradbury was like as wrong as he could possibly be when he said that Fahrenheit 451 was not a book about censorship and that it was in fact a book about why TV is bad. He's just wrong. Like, he didn't know what he was doing. He wrote one of the most powerful books about censorship ever written. He's just wrong. I've been wrong about what I wrote and what it meant. It's fine. This is the kind of numinous experience of creation. But what I will say is that because fiction is about this intrinsically science fictional exercise of imagining what someone else thinks, right? Like all narrative fiction has some pretense to the idea that you can be in the head of another person and know what they're thinking, which is literally something no one in the history of the human race has ever done, right? Telepathy doesn't exist. It has never existed. So like like Jane Austen is a science fiction writer because she makes you think that you can know what someone else is thinking, right? Like, we're all science fiction writers in that regard. And this idea that you can know what other people are going to do, that you can experience their emotions vicariously, is a very powerful tool for empathy. But it's also an intuition pump, right? Because fiction tends to turn on circumstances that are extreme in some way, otherwise the story is a little boring. The canonical example being like zombie apocalypse, say. These are circumstances that you are unlikely to have experienced firsthand. And so your only experience of them is the narrative conventions around them. And so when things that have a kind of echo of that happen, right, after the lockdown and the pandemic, say, when it seems like maybe there's some breakdown happening, your intuition is driven by your vicarious experience of made up stories by people who themselves never experienced a zombie apocalypse. And so if the zombie apocalypse story, whose like canonical form is like something bad happens and your neighbors come over to literally eat you, right? That in the time of crisis, your neighbors are the crisis, not the thing that get you through the crisis. If that's the form that you have, then you do what a bunch of my weird ass neighbors here in Burbank, California did when the pandemic hit, where we had lines around the block at all the gun stores. We would remember when we all used to go for walks during lockdown? We'd go for walks and we'd see these people all standing in line and we'd make jokes about like, God, they must be incredible marksmen if they're going to shoot the virus. But they were just envisioning this future in which something bad happens, and as soon as the lights go out, your neighbors come over to eat you. And it's because like they've read a lot of fiction that convinced them of that. I mean, a moment's kind of cursory inspection would tell you that we've had lots of times in our history when the lights went out, that things break down all the time. And then when they do, the fact that we've survived them tells you that for the most part, people help each other. That maybe there are people around the margins who, the rich people in the lifeboats from the Titanic that were only half full, that didn't want to let poor people in and made them drown. Maybe there are some of those people, and I think a lot of the times they're rich people, because I think that is coterminal with like doing the things that it takes to get rich, being, having a howling void where your empathy should be. But I think that the actual like kind of great plurality of humanity want to help each other, and if we convince each other that your neighbors, when the lights go out, are going to come over with the contents of their freezer to have a barbecue because it's going to spoil anyway, then when your neighbor shows up at your door, you'll greet them with barbecue tongs and not a shotgun. And so, that is like an actual predictor of how we will weather the storms when they come, is what we think we'll do when the storms come, what we think our neighbors will do. And that all comes out of reading made up stories from people like me who have themselves never had to fight zombies and who are just making it up.
Yeah. I'm reminded that in Taiwan and also Japan, because we suffer a lot from earthquakes and typhoons and tsunamis and whatnot, it tends to be that in the times of pandemic, we refer back to the times where we actually do help each other across different faiths, different social configurations, and so on. Because it's also some kind of selection bias, because people who flee Taiwan around those times of crisis, they're not here. So kind of by definition, everybody who remained are here to help each other out, and the stories resonate with all of them. So I think it makes sense to think about our stories as grounded in common experiences. And it's my job as a poetician to remind people time and again that you probably have experienced something like that. In Taiwan, of course, we experienced SARS in 2003. But even for cutting edge Terminator like AI narratives, most of us, when in our childhood, have read the Japanese Doraemon stories. So when I say, assistive intelligence is just like Doraemon, that evokes a different, more pro-social kind of neighborhood feeling vis-a-vis machine training in general. So I do think that there is a role for not just sincerity, but also authenticity of shared experience in storytelling, especially politically, but also I think poetically as well. Amazing.
I wonder if we can take a moment as non-Europeans to risk a comment on Europe. So it strikes me that there are a lot of this territory that we're covering about democracy and pluralism and technology has a lot of relevance to, and also about storytelling, has a lot of relevance to the European project, right? So there are a few, in a few ways. One, the European project strikes me as a fairly amazing, quite successful story of telling a narrative, inviting people into a narrative of shared identity. There's the European Union as a set of institutions is also quite a unique experiment in pluralism from the point of view of sort of constitutional pluralism, institutional pluralism, competing centers of power. And then at the same time, there's also one of the most persistent critiques of European institutions is democratic deficit. So in other words, we've got the European Commission, we've got the CJEU, we've got these interesting institutions with competing pluralistic. We've got the member states and the European institutions and so on. And yet the democratic links are often questioned, whether they're in proper health. And I wonder if either of you have thoughts about this from any perspective, but also seems like an interesting case of kind of pluralism versus democracy. I mean, can you have one without the other?
Audrey, I'll let you go first since you're the politician here.
Yes, I'm the politician here. When Elvis, President Thomas Hendrik Elvis, previously former president of Estonia, visited Taiwan not so long ago, he mentioned that, NATO was formed because of geopolitical tensions and the fact that there's something common to defend. But he also mentioned that in the digital era, which is now, when people identify with similar values, that automatically make them neighbors. And I think this is quite powerful. When the Nordic Institute for Interoperable Systems, when NICE was formed, it was, I believe, Finland, Iceland, and Estonia who shared their X-row systems, so that it's not just about placing encrypted backups to each other to survive some zombie apocalypse, but rather is a way to make it as easy and auditable to exchange data and documents internationally as easy it is domestically, and share the burden of maintaining an aging code base, I'm sure, and refactoring them into reusable components. This is at the root of the idea of public money, public code, or public code foundation in the FSFE. But when Taiwan expressed our interest in joining, I'm part of the Public Code Foundation now as a strategic advisor, suggesting our own use of licensing materials like CC0, which is free software but not open source, but we figured that out. And everything that I receive says that it's as if we're adjacent to the Nordic countries. It's as simple as that. It's just like this pull request that's sent across Git repositories. Really, the coordination technologies has now progressed to the point that anything that we use to run internally, our website, our bureaucracy, the entire system is perfectly capable of being just free software collaboration software. Actually, in the digital minister's office in the past 5.5 years, we just rely on the one software called Sandstorm, and that solves all our collaboration needs, and it's from the free software community. So as long as other people, whether they're in Canada, in New Zealand, in far off places that's not Europe, subscribe to the digital human rights idea and use the same public code, I'd argue that this creates if not unilateral, at least a multi-stakeholder / unilateral hybrid that makes it far more easy for working level career public servants and so on to work together. And once we do that, the demos in democracy expands. The constituents expands. It becomes far easier to democratically audit, not just in a cybersecurity penetration testing case, whether we do that, but also on the procedural case, because there's more people from more different angles looking at those 800 pages documents, and that increases the bandwidth of democracy. And with more eyes, I guess, we reduce the latency. So that's my initial take.
I think that's really smart. I had a friend over yesterday for supper, and we were talking about, he's Canadian. I'm from Canada. I then became British and now am also an American citizen, but my grandfather is a Pole who is also Belarusian, and my grandmother was a Russian, and my dad was born in Azerbaijan. So hypothetically, I could get 4 more passports. I have 3 citizenships now, and I could get more. We were talking about the nature of federalism in these places. And, in Canada, Confederation is still very new. Parts of Canada did not come into Confederation until after the Second World War, and were separate political entities until then. I mean, they were part of the Commonwealth together, but they were not under a common political project. And these are small places, small, low population places. And you can see why, if you're, say, Newfoundland, the deal of joining Canada, if it's a purely majoritarian project, is not a good deal for you. Because Quebec and Ontario and British Columbia are going to decide what Canada needs. And if it's not what you need, you don't have the votes to resist them. And they're just going to come and move the furniture around where you live in ways that don't suit you, but suit the majority, right? And so, in America, where you have federalism that's much older, you have a lot of people who are quite rightly alarmed and furious at how the anti-majoritarian institutions of federalism have been put to use. So that's the Senate and the Electoral College and these other institutions that say, for someone like me in California, my vote counts, I think, 1/18 of what the vote for someone in Wyoming does in terms of how many senators we get to elect. And yet, if you ask yourself, would California be the world's 6th largest economy if we had a hard border between us and the Atlantic Ocean, or between us and Canada? It would not. I mean, leaving aside all the economies of scale of being part of this much larger country, right? Just the geographic and territorial considerations, the improvements that come about as a result of having, say, unified air traffic or unified rail system, they really are hard to overstate. And so then you jump to Europe, and Europe is a much younger federation than Canada. So Canada sits halfway, I think, between Europe and the United States in terms of its federalism. And in Europe, you do have states that are on the literal and figurative periphery of the European project that are quite small and, frankly, are not good faith adherents to the European project. They're selling golden passports to oligarchs. They're laundering money. They're creating tax and regulatory havens. They're allowing Jeff Bezos to maintain the fiction that every ebook sold in Europe is sold in Luxembourg, which was a thing that happened for, 15 years to avoid VAT before finally the European Union did something about it. And you have the equivalent of a California exit, right? You have Brexit. And you see exactly what it looks like if you have a hard border between you and the rest of your federation, your former federation. The United Kingdom is in a lot of trouble. I say this as a British citizen. The United Kingdom is in a lot of trouble. And I don't know what to make of it all, because Viktor Orban scares the hell out of me. And I think that Cyprus is a rotten money laundry. And I think Malta is a rotten money laundry. And I think the Netherlands is a tax haven that allows the worst companies in the world to hide their profits. And I think Scottish numbered companies are a way for dictators to get away with owning anonymous assets all around the world in ways that supercharge their ability to visit absolute misery on the people around them. And yet, I also understand why you can't just kick out the small countries. And I also understand why the small countries are looking for another way to thrive. And it seems to me that if there was a project we wanted to figure out in Europe and in other federations, because federalism is in trouble, right? Everywhere you go, Australian federalism is in trouble, Canadian federalism is in trouble, American federalism is in an absolute shambles. I don't know about the Swiss, but certainly the Russian Federation is in trouble, right? If we're going to figure out federalism, we need to figure out what you do about the need for anti-majoritarian policies as an absolutely critical element of creating and maintaining federation, and then the problems that those anti-majoritarian policies create in terms of making it easy to corrupt the entire federation and turn its resources to projects of corruption.
That's great. There's so much there. There's Cory, you may know that RadicalxChange has done a lot of work on systems of voting and systems of power sharing that try to sort of thread this needle of non-majoritarian decision systems, and couldn't agree more that it's incredibly it's at the heart of what we need to solve, and and we need new models, and along those lines, Audrey, you've made interesting comments about sort of seeing Taiwan as a in a way, kind of a midpoint or a point of mediation.
We're the place where the Eurasian plate and the Philippine Sea plate bump into each other, quite literally. Violent earthquakes, yes. But Taiwan also literally grow by a couple centimeters every year because of that.
Yeah, and I wonder if you could. I don't know if you have thoughts about this. I mean, about seeing the Taiwanese system. I mean, I'm not sure if we can bring federalism in here, but just as a midpoint between the sort of, I think you may or may not have used the phrase sort of American capitalism, European values-based democracy, and Chinese like centralized or AI driven governance and
authoritarian intelligence. So I think it's very interesting because in Taiwan, we've long since since we democratized from the grassroots level without much bloodshed or violence, as typical in the third wave democratization. So again, kind of just by selection bias, people who remain here are okay with the idea that we have 20 national languages, including sign language, that we're the only country in Asia that has full marriage equality and so on, because people who cannot tolerate this sort of plurality, well, they're not here anymore, right? So people who remained, all 23 million people, plus quite a few gold card holders, in which Cory is invited to be a gold card holder, so you can have another passport to your collection sometime in the future. We're all for the idea of pluralism as a source of creative tension. That is to say, the fact that when it comes to, we just had a constitutional court debate about the use of national health insurance data for scientific purposes, but whether it requires a opting out or consent framework and so on. So the fact that we have very erudite academicians trained in the European point of view, the more chokepoint capitalism point of view, and the authoritarian intelligence point of view is treated as an asset in the Taiwan political sphere. Because then we firmly believe that just as we can figure out that, we can respect the traditions of the Confucian nature by saying that when two people who are of the same sex wed, they wed as individuals with all the same rights and duties, but their families don't. They don't form kinship. That makes everyone happy, and everybody can live with it, because people are, after all, just trying to preserve this Confucian lineage. But they also understand in the other national languages, the indigenous ones, some have a matriarchal norm, some doesn't care about gender when choosing the successor of the leader of the tribe, and so on. And so this eclectic, this very kind of, to paraphrase Larry Wall, the more than one way to do it, always one more way to do it. I think is an asset in the Taiwan political scene when it comes to debate such topics.
I love that Pearl is part of the governing structure, governing philosophy of Taiwan. That's awesome.
Yeah, always one more way to do it. Yeah.
Both of you have recently, well, Cory for a long time, and I know that Audrey, you're thinking of now about how to intervene in the information space, basically, how to get your writing out there, how to get your words out there in a way that that accords with your values and avoids the all of the issues of chokepoint capitalism and platform control, and potentially just points a way forward for people to participate in the public conversation. So I'd love to hear any thoughts that either of you have about this.
Well, I would say that, there's doing this stuff, taking personal choices is, of course, important. And, the life of someone doing creative work is always fraught. The problem of how to get someone to care about the thing you care about is the hard problem of advertising, religion, politics, and creative livelihoods. If it were systematizable, if you could just be if you go through steps A through Z, other people will care about what you want, then we would live in a very different world. As we were talking about, I think before we started the recording, that we would be in a world of mind control, right? Because if you can just get other people to care about stuff by following a set of steps, then you're taking away their free will, because what you care about is pretty foundational to the idea of free will. So that said, the big problems with the structures of the creative labor market, right, where there are these choke points, where platforms, publishers, record labels, and so on have merged to monopoly. Right? We have 3 major record labels in the world. We have 1 major video platform, now 2 if you count TikTok as being a direct competitor to YouTube. We have 1 major social network, right? If you exclude Chinese and Russian networks. And Facebook is so much bigger than any of those other networks that, yes, I love Twitter, but Twitter has 100 million users and Facebook has 4 billion. They are not a competitor of Facebook's in any meaningful way. Where you have 4 major publishers, where you have 4 major movie studios, where you have 1 major cinematic exhibitor in the United States, where you have market concentration up and down the supply chain, including in things like talent agencies, where the 3 talent agencies here in Hollywood bought all their competitors and then in turn were bought out by private equity funds, who then began to squeeze talent and cut the money that the talent got from the talent agency, right? The talent agency's raison d'etre became servicing private equity debts that were loaded up when the private equity firms took them over, and not servicing the talent who brought in the money. And with only 3 of them, they could converge on a set of terms that were quite hostile to creators' interests. And you just couldn't go around them. And the thing that actually fixed the talent agency issue was that every writer in Writers Guild West went on strike for 3 years. They fired every agent in Hollywood for 3 years with 100% solidarity. And the agencies, after 3 years, caved. So it wasn't that someone figured out a way for they themselves to make it work. And indeed, if you're a fancy writer, you probably could make CAA or one of the other big agencies treat you well, cut you a sweetheart deal on the side. But those writers too threw their lot in. The most successful writers in Hollywood threw their lot in with every other writer in the union. And we all fired our agents. Every agent in Hollywood was fired on the same day. And after 3 years, they caved because it took institutional reform and institutional power against institutional power. And individuals could not fix that, except to the extent that they went out and organized institutions, organized their union, participated in their union, organized political answers. There is no recycling your way out of climate change. There's no shopping your way out of monopoly. And there's no, way of bootstrapping your way out of the creative choke points in our culture marketplaces.
Yeah, we must pair collective intelligence with collective action. This is always true. We just had a meeting yesterday about how to make sure that journalism stays relevant and vibrant in the age of, chokepoint capitalism. I think journalism is just like public health, epidemiology, expertise when it comes to infodemic control, as it was for pandemic control. That is to say, the more journalism is not just understood, but practiced. So digital competence, not just literacy, by everyday people, by people in basic education, in lifelong education. The more journalists we have among us, the harder for mind control to work, right? Because sometimes it's not real mind control, it's just some tricks, right? The surveillance capitalism narrative is I think Cory made a very similar point. It's not actually mind control, but it's slightly framed in such a way that it might controls the advertiser think that it's mind control. So something like that is actually very easily refuted with practical civic journalism of people actually checking whether the targeted advertisement actually worked the way that they advertise those advertisement engines. But if we rely on just a few large institutional media to do the journalism, then it becomes harder to unravel the whole story. It certainly takes longer. It will be higher latency and so on. So I think a lot of this is just to recognize journalism as a common good when practiced. And then to surface, again, just like the writers that can organize collective action, the civic hackers, the fact checkers, the community, everyone who works on something that can be broadly interpreted as journalism together and take collective action. So that's my current thinking. And I thank Cory for this very powerful Hollywood example that I'm going to share.
Well, that's great. I want to say apropos journalism as well, that we have this story that the the toxic element of the relationship between big tech and media is that big tech is stealing media's content, right? That like if Facebook is a place where you can paste part of an article and talk about it, that it's a copyright violation. And that's what's really hurting the newspapers. And, you know, that if we were to stop that, if we were like to decide under what circumstances people were allowed to reproduce elements of the news and discuss it or link to it, we would be producing a great democratic deficit, right? Because like the ability to talk about the news is how we do sense making and collective work. And when you
it would be like unique tracking ID for everyone.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And when you look at what's actually happened to the advertising revenues at the big media companies, what's happened is that there's a duopoly of Facebook and Google that are not stealing their content, they're stealing their money. They're committing ad fraud, right? They're running rigged auctions. This just came up in the FTC's case against Facebook and Google, where they had this program called Jedi Blue, where they secretly colluded to rig ad auctions so that they would steal their money. And so, you know, we put all this energy into like link taxes and bargaining codes and whatever that are meant to shift a few value points from giant tech to a few giant media companies, usually not the smaller ones, to make them fully dependent on giant tech as well, to make them in fact partisans who will brief for giant tech, because if giant tech goes away, so do the transfer payments. And instead what we could be doing is saying the unlawful fraudulent dealing that is rampant in the ad marketplace that allows two firms to pocket about 50% of the ad spend of 80% of the ads is the reason that news is having problems. And we could fix it by just making them not allowed to do fraud anymore. And it seems like that should be a lot less controversial, right? Who is gonna stump for the fraudsters as opposed to stumping for the right to, like, you know, decide who can link to the news?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there's anyone who said fraud is a public good and journalism isn't.
Yeah,
cannot
exactly.
make that argument.
It's a much better framing.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. Very grateful to you both for taking the time to have this conversation. If there's any, if either of you have any sort of closing thoughts for the audience, we can load them in here. Otherwise,
in closing, I just want to say that I'm such an admirer of Audrey and the work you're doing there. It's really an inspiration. Thank you for the example that you're setting there in a place that is, by all accounts, wonderful, and certainly in a unique and imperiled situation that needs really creative thinking. And I am in awe and admiration of the things you do.
Thank you. And in turn, I'm really must attribute all this work, not just influenced by Clay Shirk and Larry Wall, but this whole idea of we can actually build a fork of the government out of ad hoc groups and adhocracy. I first encountered that in Down and Out in Magic.
Oh, wow. Well, that's lovely. Thank you, Audrey. That's nice. And I'll add, I'll add to the audience, I mentioned my grandfather's a Pole. He was born in Łódź. So I am a Łódźer at 3 generations removed. Enjoy it. He didn't leave under very nice circumstances, I'll say that. But I think it's actually illegal in Poland for me to explain why he had to leave now, because of laws forbidding certain accounts of the Holocaust. But he spoke highly of it.
Well, on that note, thank you both so much for your all the work you do and the clarity of thought. It's much appreciated and much needed. So
thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Bye, Audrey.
Bye.
Yeah. See ya.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the U.S. We have about 159 partners in the United States right now, and the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
Atlas Network, it connects people from all over the world defending the idea of human dignity, defending human rights and personal liberties.
Atlas Network is focusing on, I think, the most important and moral cause in the entire world.
We partner with local innovators, local leaders who understand conditions on the ground in communities facing real challenges. We look at the people from the worldwide freedom movement that are passionate, are ready to make a difference, understand local conditions, and we invest in them.
At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity.
The United States does not have a lock on the idea of freedom and liberty. Those ideas are beyond borders.
One of the main goals of Atlas Network is to eradicate poverty around the world, and we do that by investing millions of dollars in our partners' work every year.
Historically, wealthy nations around the world have tried to help low-income countries develop. The way we've been doing it traditionally has not really been working. So there's a movement to do development differently, and that means we need to step back as outsiders and rethink the role that we're playing in helping people in low-income countries achieve their dreams.
We want to make the world a better place. We want to make the world a freer world.
All of us want to leave a legacy and be part of something big to make a better world. This is exactly the work of Atlas Network.
With our growing number of hundreds of successful partners, we're stronger than ever.
Changing the world
Changing the world
Changing the world
starts together
with us.